It was a sweet portrait of parents and their son, but look more closely at the boy's hand. Dr. Marcus Webb adjusted his reading glasses and leaned closer to his computer monitor on a gray November afternoon in 2024. As a historian specializing in post-Civil War Southern history at the College of Charleston, he had examined thousands of photographs from the late 19th century. Most told familiar stories of the era: wealthy families posing in their finest clothes, stern-faced ancestors frozen in time by early photographic technology. This particular image had arrived 3 days earlier as part of a donation from the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, a 97-year-old Charleston resident who had passed away, leaving behind decades of accumulated family documents and photographs. Marcus had been methodically cataloging the collection when this photograph caught his attention. The image showed a well-appointed parlor, circa 1895, based on the furniture and decor. A white couple in their 40s sat formally arranged, the man standing with one hand on an ornate chair, the woman seated elegantly beside him. Between them stood a black boy who appeared to be around 10 years old, dressed in a smart suit with a crisp white collar. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were the words, "Mr. and Mrs. Robert Whitmore with their son Thomas, Charleston, South Carolina, March 1895. At first glance, it appeared to be a portrait of a family, likely depicting the adoption of a child by a white family during an era when such arrangements were uncommon but not unheard of. Marcus had seen similar photographs before, though they were rare enough to warrant closer examination. But something about this image troubled him. He couldn't quite identify what it was initially, just a nagging sense that something was off. The boy's expression seemed carefully neutral, almost blank. His posture was rigid in a way that went beyond the typical stiffness required by long exposure times. Marcus zoomed in on the digital scan, examining each face more carefully. Robert Whitmore looked prosperous and confident with the bearing of a successful businessman. His wife, Constance, appeared elegant and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Then Marcus focused on the boy. Thomas stood between his supposed parents, but there was no physical contact, no hand on his shoulder, no gesture of affection or connection. His eyes stared directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed unusual for a child. Marcus saved the image to his priority research folder and made a note to investigate further. The Whitmore name was familiar, a prominent Charleston family involved in textile manufacturing and real estate during the late 19th century. Finding information about them would be straightforward. What he didn't yet realize was that this single photograph would unravel a story that had been deliberately hidden for 129 years, a story of theft, deception, and a child's desperate attempt to leave a message for the future. Marcus began his investigation the following morning by searching through Charleston's historical records. Robert Whitmore had indeed been a successful textile merchant who owned several properties in the downtown area. He and his wife Constance had married in 1882, but had no biological children according to birth records. The first oddity Marcus discovered was that there was no formal adoption record for Thomas Whitmore. In the 1890s, adoptions were often informal arrangements, but families of the Whitmores' social standing typically created legal documentation for such matters, especially when property inheritance was involved. Marcus expanded his search, looking through newspaper archives from 1895. He found several mentions of the Whitmore family in society pages, charity events, business announcements, church functions. In one article from April 1895, there was a brief mention. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Whitmore were accompanied by their ward, young Thomas, at the Easter service at St. Philip's Church. Ward, not son. The terminology was significant. Marcus contacted Dr. Jennifer Cole, a colleague who specialized in digital restoration and forensic analysis of historical photographs. When Jennifer arrived at his office 2 days later with her scanning equipment, Marcus showed her the Whitmore family portrait. "I need you to analyze this at the highest resolution possible," Marcus explained. "There's something about this image that doesn't feel right, but I can't pinpoint what it is." Jennifer set up her equipment and began the detailed scanning process. The advanced scanner captured the photograph in segments, building a composite image with resolution far beyond what the naked eye could perceive. When she loaded the enhanced file onto her laptop, both historians leaned in to examine it. "Let me increase the contrast and adjust the clarity," Jennifer said, her fingers working quickly across the keyboard. As the image sharpened on the screen, Marcus suddenly drew in a sharp breath. "Jennifer, zoom in on the boy's right hand." The hand had been partially hidden in the photograph, positioned near the side of Thomas's body, fingers pressed against the dark fabric of his trousers. In the original print, the detail had been nearly invisible, but with digital enhancement, the positioning became unmistakably clear. Thomas's fingers were arranged in a very specific configuration, thumb and pinky extended, 3 middle fingers folded down, held at a precise angle against his leg. "That's not a natural resting position," Jennifer observed. "That's deliberate. He's making some kind of signal." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Can you enhance it further? I need to see every detail of that hand position." Marcus spent the next week researching hand signals and gestures used in the late 19th century. He consulted with experts in sign language history, examined military signals from the era, and searched through archives documenting communication methods used by various communities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Harrison, a professor of African American history at the University of South Carolina, responded to Marcus's inquiry with intriguing information. What you're describing sounds similar to danger signals that were taught within some free black communities in the South during the post-Reconstruction era, Patricia explained during their video call. After the Civil War, free black families, especially those who owned property or businesses, faced significant threats. Some families developed their own signals that could be used to communicate danger or distress in situations where verbal communication was impossible or too risky. She sent Marcus several historical documents, including testimonies from descendants of free black families who had lived in South Carolina during the 1890s. One particular account, recorded in a 1930s oral history project, described a hand signal used by the Thompson family of Charleston. "My grandfather taught all his children a special sign," the testimony read. "If any of us was ever in trouble and couldn't speak freely, if we was around dangerous people or being forced to do something against our will, we was to make this signal with our hand, thumb and little finger out, other 3 fingers down, held against the leg where it might not be too obvious. That was our family's way of saying, 'I need help,' without words." Marcus stared at the description, then looked back at the enhanced photograph of Thomas Whitmore. The hand position matched exactly. He immediately began searching for any records of black families named Thompson in Charleston during the 1890s. What he found sent chills down his spine. In January 1895, a man named Samuel Thompson, a free black carpenter and property owner, had been reported missing by his sister, Ada Thompson. Samuel had owned a modest but valuable piece of land on the outskirts of Charleston, where he operated a successful woodworking business. He had a 10-year-old son named Thomas. The missing person report had been filed with the Charleston police, but the investigation appeared to have gone nowhere. The last entry in the file, dated March 1895, stated simply, "No leads. Case suspended." Marcus pulled up the Whitmore family photograph again, studying Thomas's face with new understanding. This wasn't Robert and Constance Whitmore's adopted son. This was Samuel Thompson's kidnapped child, standing in a stranger's parlor, making a desperate signal that his father had taught him. A silent cry for help, captured in a photograph and preserved for 129 years. Marcus knew he needed concrete evidence to support his theory. He spent the next several days in the Charleston County archives, pulling property records from the 1890s. What he discovered formed a damning pattern. Samuel Thompson had purchased his land in 1888, a 5-acre parcel on Meeting Street Road that included a workshop and small residence. The property records showed he had paid for it in full, an impressive achievement for the era. His woodworking business had apparently thrived, serving both black and white clients. Then, in February 1895, just 1 month after Samuel's disappearance, the property had been transferred to Robert Whitmore. The transfer document cited settlement of outstanding debts as the reason, claiming Samuel Thompson had owed Whitmore a substantial sum and had signed over the property as payment. Marcus examined the signature on the transfer document. He was no handwriting expert, but even to his untrained eye, something seemed off. He requested copies of other documents bearing Samuel Thompson's signature: business contracts, a loan application from 1890, a letter to the city council regarding road maintenance. Comparing the signatures, the forgery became apparent. Samuel's authentic signature had a distinctive flourish on the final N of Thompson and a particular way of crossing his T's. The signature on the property transfer document lacked these characteristics entirely. Marcus documented everything carefully, photographing each document and creating a detailed timeline. In February 1895, Samuel Thompson disappeared. In the same month, his property was fraudulently transferred to Robert Whitmore. In March 1895, a boy named Thomas appeared in the Whitmore household, described as their ward. But where was Samuel Thompson himself? Marcus expanded his search to death records, burial registries, and cemetery records. He found nothing under Samuel's name in Charleston for 1895, or the years immediately following. He did, however, find something else. In the records of the Charleston Police Department, he discovered a notation from April 1895. Robert Whitmore reported attempted burglary at his Meeting Street Road property. Intruder fled when discovered. No items taken, no suspects identified. The Meeting Street Road property, Samuel Thompson's former land. Marcus felt certain this burglary attempt had been something else entirely. Perhaps Ada Thompson or someone from the black community trying to investigate Samuel's disappearance and the suspicious property transfer. Marcus reached out to genealogical researchers who specialized in African American family histories. He needed to find descendants of Samuel Thompson or his sister Ada, someone who might have family documents, stories, or information that hadn't made it into official records. The breakthrough came through a genealogy website. Marcus had posted his inquiry about the Thompson family in several forums dedicated to Charleston and South Carolina African American genealogy. 3 weeks later, he received a message from James Thompson, a 71-year-old retired engineer living in Atlanta. "I believe Samuel Thompson was my great-great-grandfather," James wrote. "My grandmother told me stories about him when I was young. She said he was a skilled carpenter who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and that his son was taken from the family. I have some documents that belong to my great-great-aunt Ada. Would you like to see them?" Marcus immediately arranged a video call. When they connected, James showed him a leather portfolio that had belonged to Ada Thompson. Inside were letters, business documents, newspaper clippings, and most importantly, a handwritten account that Ada had written in 1896, titled, "The Truth About My Brother Samuel." James began reading aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother Samuel was a good man, a skilled craftsman, and a loving father. In January 1895, he told me he had been approached by a white businessman named Robert Whitmore, who wanted to purchase his land. Samuel refused. That land represented everything he had worked for, his independence, his son's future. Mr. Whitmore was not pleased. 2 weeks later, Samuel went to deliver a custom cabinet to a client outside of town. He never returned. I went to the police, but they showed little interest in searching for a missing black man. I went to the property and found Samuel's workshop locked. I tried to gain entry, but was told I was trespassing. Within a month, I learned that the property had been transferred to Mr. Whitmore, supposedly to settle debts Samuel never owed. I protested to anyone who would listen, but no one would help me. Then I learned something even more horrifying. Mr. Whitmore had my nephew Thomas living in his house, claiming the boy as his ward. I tried to see Thomas, to speak with him, but was turned away. I went to the authorities and was told that Mr. Whitmore had taken the boy in as an act of charity after his father abandoned him. This was a lie. Samuel would never abandon Thomas. My brother is dead, I know this in my heart, and the man who killed him has stolen his son." Ada's account continued, describing her desperate attempts to rescue Thomas. She had tried to petition the courts, but without evidence of foul play and with no legal standing as a single black woman against a wealthy white businessman, her efforts went nowhere. She had attempted to make contact with Thomas at church, but the Whitmores had begun attending a different congregation. She had even tried to speak with Constance Whitmore directly, appealing to her as a woman, but had been threatened with arrest for harassment. "I am writing this account because I fear the truth will die with me," Ada concluded. "Thomas is living with his father's murderers. He knows what happened. He is a clever boy, and he loved his father deeply. I pray that someday someone will discover the truth and Thomas will find justice." Marcus sat in stunned silence after James finished reading. The photograph suddenly took on an even more devastating significance. Thomas hadn't just been making a distress signal. He had been doing it while being forced to pose as the child of the people who had destroyed his life. "There's more," James said quietly. He pulled out another document, a yellowed piece of paper with careful handwriting. This is a letter Ada received in 1897, 2 years after Samuel disappeared. It was delivered to her anonymously, left under her door one night. She kept it all her life. The letter read, "Dear Aunt Ada, I cannot write much, or they will find this letter. I'm watched constantly. They make me call them mother and father. They burned everything I had from my real father except one thing I keep hidden. I remember the signal Papa taught me. I used it when they made me sit for the photograph. I pray someone will see it someday and understand. I have not forgotten who I am. I have not forgotten what happened to Papa. I saw where they took him that night. When I am older and stronger, I will find a way to make them pay for what they did. Do not try to rescue me. They watch for you. Stay safe. I will survive this. Your nephew, Thomas." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. "Did he ever escape? Do you know what happened to him?" James nodded slowly. "That's where the story gets complicated. Let me show you something else." He held up a photograph, a formal portrait from around 1910. It showed a young black man in his mid-20s, dressed in a suit, standing with quiet dignity. His expression was solemn but determined. This is Thomas Thompson, taken in Chicago in 1910. According to family records, he left Charleston in 1902 when he turned 17. He went north during the Great Migration, changed his surname back to Thompson, and built a new life. He became a skilled carpenter like his father, and eventually owned his own construction company. "Did he ever speak about what happened to him?" Marcus asked. "Not much, according to my grandmother. The trauma was too deep, but he did tell his children one thing. He knew exactly what happened to his father, and he knew where Robert Whitmore had hidden the evidence. But by the time Thomas was old enough and established enough to pursue justice, Robert Whitmore had died in 1904, and Constance had moved to Virginia. Thomas decided that building a good life and honoring his father's memory was more important than revenge." James paused, then added, "But Thomas did leave something behind. A sealed letter, to be opened by his descendants when the time was right. My father opened it in 1995, on the 100th anniversary of Samuel's disappearance. In it, Thomas wrote exactly what happened the night his father died, and where evidence might still be found." James sent Marcus a scanned copy of Thomas's letter, written in 1958, when Thomas was an elderly man. Marcus read it with a mixture of horror and admiration for the boy who had survived such trauma and grown into a man of strength and principle. "I am now 73 years old," Thomas had written. "I have lived a good life, built a family, and found success through honest work, as my father taught me. But there are truths I must record before I leave this world, truths about what happened in Charleston in 1895. My father, Samuel Thompson, was approached by Robert Whitmore in January of that year. Mr. Whitmore wanted to buy our land, but my father refused. The land was ours, purchased through my father's hard work, and it represented our independence and security. Mr. Whitmore became angry and made threats, but my father stood firm. On January 24th, 1895, Mr. Whitmore came to our home in the evening. I was upstairs but heard raised voices. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Mr. Whitmore told my father that if he would not sell the land voluntarily, he would lose it anyway. My father told him to leave our property. Later that same night, 2 men came to our house. I recognized one as Mr. Whitmore's business associate. They forced my father to go with them. My father told me to hide, to stay silent no matter what I heard. I hid in the cabinet my father had built with a secret compartment. He had shown it to me once as a game, never thinking I would need it for real. Through a crack in the wood, I saw them force my father out of the house. I heard my father struggling, heard him call out, then silence. I stayed hidden until morning. When I emerged, the house was empty. I ran to my Aunt Ada, but before we could go to the police, Mr. Whitmore arrived with a constable. He claimed my father had sold him the property to pay debts and had abandoned me. The constable believed him. I was taken to the Whitmore house. I lived there for 7 years. They changed my clothes, my name in public records, my entire identity. They told people I was their ward, taken in from an orphanage. Mrs. Whitmore was not cruel to me, but she was weak and afraid of her husband. Mr. Whitmore made it clear that if I ever spoke the truth, my Aunt Ada would be harmed. I endured by remembering my father's teachings. He had taught me a hand signal for danger, a way to communicate distress silently. When they forced me to pose for a family photograph in March 1895, I made that signal. I held my hand against my leg where it was barely visible, but I held it clearly enough. I hoped that someday someone would see it and understand. As for my father's body, I learned the location by accident in 1897. I overheard Mr. Whitmore and his associate talking when they thought I was asleep. My father was buried on the property, our property that Mr. Whitmore had stolen. There is a section of land near the old workshop, beneath what was once a large oak tree. The tree is likely gone now, but the location would be approximately 30 feet north of the workshop's western wall. Marcus immediately contacted the Charleston Police Department's cold case unit. Detective Sarah Martinez listened to his presentation with growing interest. While the crimes had occurred far beyond any statute of limitations, the historical significance and the possibility of recovering Samuel Thompson's remains made it a matter of public interest. The property is now owned by the city, Detective Martinez explained after researching the land records. It's part of a public park that was established in the 1950s. The original structures were demolished, but we can use ground-penetrating radar to search the area Thomas described. Marcus also reached out to James Thompson, who agreed to come to Charleston for the investigation. My family deserves closure, James said, and Samuel Thompson deserves to be properly buried with his real name and his story told truthfully. The search was scheduled for a cool morning in late November 2024. A team from the county medical examiner's office arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment. Marcus had calculated the approximate location based on Thomas's description and old property maps that showed the workshop's original position. Patricia Harrison, the African-American history professor who had helped Marcus identify the hand signal, attended as a consultant. Local news crews had gotten word of the investigation and stood at a respectful distance, cameras ready. The radar operator moved slowly across the designated area, examining the readings on her screen. After nearly an hour, she stopped and marked a spot with a flag. "There's definitely something here," she announced, "an anomaly in the soil consistent with a burial site." The excavation team began carefully removing soil. Marcus stood beside James Thompson, both men silent and tense. After 2 hours of painstaking work, one of the excavators called out, "We found something." As the team carefully brushed away soil, skeletal remains began to emerge. Beside the bones were fragments of clothing, and, remarkably well preserved in the clay soil, a leather tool belt, the kind used by carpenters in the late 19th century. One of the excavators held up a metal object she had found near the remains. It was a brass nameplate, tarnished but still legible. S. Thompson, Fine Carpentry. James Thompson's knees buckled and Marcus steadied him. Tears streamed down the elderly man's face. "Great-great-grandfather," he whispered. "We found you. Finally, we found you." The forensic examination confirmed what everyone had suspected. The remains were those of an African-American male, approximately 35 to 40 years old at time of death. The bones showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, a violent death, not an accident or natural causes. Carbon dating and analysis of the clothing fragments and artifacts confirmed the remains dated to the 1890s. DNA testing would take several weeks, but James Thompson had agreed to provide a sample for comparison. While the scientific process continued, Marcus compiled his research into a comprehensive report. He had documented everything: the property fraud, Ada's testimony, Thomas's letter, the photograph with its hidden signal, and now the discovery of Samuel's remains. Local and national media picked up the story. Headlines read, "129-year-old murder, solved through child's secret signal and photograph," and "A hidden hand gesture finally brings justice to forgotten victim." The Charleston Historical Society, where Marcus worked, organized a public presentation of the finding. The gallery was packed with over 300 people, historians, community members, descendants of Charleston's free black community, and members of the press. Marcus stood before the assembled crowd with the enhanced photograph of Thomas displayed on a large screen behind him. He walked through the investigation step by step, showing how each piece of evidence had led to the next. This photograph was taken in March 1895, Marcus explained, pointing to the image. To anyone who saw it at the time, it appeared to show a respectable white family with their adopted black child, a seemingly charitable arrangement in an era of rigid racial segregation. But Thomas Thompson, the 10-year-old boy in this image, was not an adopted son. He was a kidnapping victim, forced to live with the men who murdered his father and stole his property. Marcus zoomed in on Thomas's hand. This gesture, barely visible in the original print, hidden against his leg, was Thomas's way of crying out for help in the only way available to him. His father had taught him this signal for exactly such a situation, when he was in danger but couldn't speak freely. He continued, describing how the signal had remained unnoticed for 129 years, until modern digital enhancement technology made it visible. Thomas Thompson survived 7 years in that household. He never forgot who he was or what had happened to his father. In 1902, at age 17, he escaped to Chicago, reclaimed his real surname, and built a successful life as a carpenter, honoring his father's trade and memory. Patricia Harrison spoke next, providing historical context about the dangers faced by free black property owners in the post-Reconstruction South. Samuel Thompson's story is not unique, she explained. Many African-American landowners and businessmen were targeted by white supremacists who used violence, fraud, and intimidation to steal their property. What makes this case remarkable is that we have such clear documentation of what happened and that Thomas Thompson's courage in making that signal ultimately led to the truth being revealed. The DNA results came back 6 weeks later, confirming that the remains were indeed those of Samuel Thompson, James Thompson's great-great-grandfather. The Charleston Medical Examiner officially ruled the death a homicide, closing a case that had remained open and largely forgotten for more than a century. Samuel Thompson's remains were released to his family for proper burial. On a bright January morning in 2025, exactly 130 years after his murder, Samuel was laid to rest in a historic African-American cemetery in Charleston. His gravestone bore his name, his dates of birth and death, and an inscription chosen by his descendants. Skilled craftsman, devoted father, stolen from his son, but never forgotten. Beside Samuel's grave, the family placed a smaller memorial stone for Thomas Thompson, who had died in Chicago in 1962 and been buried there. The inscription read, Thomas Thompson, 1885-1962, beloved son of Samuel Thompson. His courage across time brought truth to light. The ceremony was attended by over 500 people. James Thompson spoke, his voice strong despite his emotions. My great-great-grandfather was murdered for refusing to give up what he had rightfully earned. His son was kidnapped and forced to live with his father's killers, but Thomas never forgot the truth, and he left us a message that survived across 129 years. Today, Samuel Thompson finally receives the dignity and recognition he was denied in life. Marcus stood among the mourners, watching as James placed a carpenter's square on Samuel's grave, a symbol of his trade and his integrity. The photograph that had started this entire investigation had been framed and placed on an easel beside the grave. In the enlarged image, Thomas's hand signal was clearly visible, a silent cry for help that had finally been heard. The story didn't end with the burial. The city of Charleston officially apologized for the police department's failure to properly investigate Samuel's disappearance in 1895. The park that now occupied Samuel's stolen land was renamed Thompson Memorial Park, with signs explaining the history of the property and the injustice that had occurred there. The property that had been fraudulently transferred to Robert Whitmore was symbolically returned to the Thompson family through the dedication of a community center on the park grounds. The Thomas Thompson Community Center would provide educational programs, job training, and resources for young people, particularly focusing on carpentry and skilled trades. Marcus's research was published in several academic journals and formed the basis of an exhibition at the Charleston Historical Society titled Hidden Voices: How One Photograph Revealed a 129-Year-Old Crime. The exhibition explored not only the Thompson case, but the broader pattern of violence and property theft targeting African-American families in the post-Reconstruction South. The photograph itself became the centerpiece of the exhibition, accompanied by detailed explanations of Thomas's hand signal, the investigation that followed, and the ultimate discovery of the truth. Thousands of visitors came to see it, many moved to tears by Thomas's courage and the long journey to justice. One afternoon, several months after the exhibition opened, Marcus stood in the gallery watching visitors examine the photograph. A teacher brought a group of middle school students explaining the historical context and the importance of bearing witness to difficult truths. One young girl raised her hand. Did Thomas ever get to be happy, she asked, after everything that happened to him? Marcus smiled gently. Thomas Thompson lived to be 77 years old. He married, had children and grandchildren, and built a successful business. He survived terrible trauma, but he didn't let it destroy him. He honored his father's memory by living with integrity and by making sure the truth would eventually come out. In his final letter, he wrote that he found peace in building things, just like his father taught him, and in knowing that truth has a way of surfacing, even after generations of silence. The girl nodded thoughtfully, looking back at the photograph with new understanding. As visitors continued to flow through the gallery, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a routine cataloging task in a dusty storage room. One photograph, overlooked for more than a century, had contained a message powerful enough to cross time itself. Thomas Thompson's hand, positioned carefully against his leg in a gesture only his father would have taught him, had spoken across 129 years. It had told a story of murder, theft, and injustice, but it had also told a story of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. The signal had finally been seen. The truth had finally been told. And Samuel and Thomas Thompson, separated by violence but reunited in memory, had finally received the justice they had been denied for so long.